I'm going to stay up here and introduce the next segment, and you will excuse the fact that I can only have Western references because that's where I'm from. But if Aaron was a rock star, here we have the god of like music, of the whole history of music, like together, Mick Jagger, John Lennon, and Michael Jackson all together. We're gonna have on stage actually Professor Lim Siong Guan, who used to be principal private secretary to Lee Kuan Yew himself, and then was the head of the Singapore Civil Service. And you understand what it means, not only to have him here in any case, but for this kind of symposium. He was there when Singapore was designed. He was there when all of this prototyping and experimenting and system thinking we're talking about actually was at its beginning. And he's going to be interviewed today by Charlotte McCann, who's been for a few years the Southeast Asia correspondent of The Economist, and will leave on Sunday to go back to Washington, D.C. So in a way, this is her last gift to us and a way to gather all of she has felt in these years here in Singapore and accumulated as experience and as learning, and interview Siong Guan about it. So it's going to be a wonderful segment, and I would like to call you both on stage.
Thank you for that introduction, Paula. It is such a treat for me to be here today, especially in my last week in Singapore, and to be interviewing you, Siong Guan. In your many years involved in public service in Singapore, you witnessed the country become a peaceful, prosperous country. In fact, you helped it to become a peaceful, prosperous country, one of the wealthiest in the world. So I think it's easy to forget just how precarious Singapore's future seemed to be when it became independent in 1965. I mean, it was a small country in an often hostile region. The task facing Lee Kuan Yew of ensuring the survival of the country must have seemed monumental. So how did he go about designing a nation and a state that would not just survive, but thrive?
Well, thanks very much, Charlotte, and thanks very much, Paulo, for the introduction. I must say, how did he go about designing? That was your question. But quite frankly, we didn't know what he was doing. I don't know what I was doing, but Aaron made sense of it all. No, so when Aaron put 1 to 7, I didn't realize I've been doing such a great job of design, and Lee Kuan Yew was the greatest designer of all, and he didn't know it either. So. Now I want to say that Singapore is still a place which is where everything is always precarious and vulnerable, and maybe that's one of the big explanations that you start off with this idea that we are small, we are vulnerable, and so we have to figure things out and do whatever makes the most sense. I want to say that when Singapore became independent in 1965, it was an independence which was unplanned, unanticipated, unwelcome. But the priorities were very clear to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. The priorities, the first priority of all was jobs, and then second was housing, third was education. And interestingly, jobs is an immediate thing, housing maybe is a 5-year thing, and education is a 10 or 15 or 20-year thing. So the span of what he was dreaming was already extended beyond just talking of what the immediate needs was. So just as an illustration about jobs, and this was something which had all the time been Singapore's big challenge. Started in 1959 when we became internally self-governing. In 1965 we became independent and were all on our own. 1967 when the British gave notice of withdrawal of British military from Singapore, which accounted for 20% of Singapore's GDP and 20% of Singapore's employment. So between Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the people of Singapore, what the fears and what the concerns were. So about jobs, basically the decision was that the solution, or at least a big part of the solution for creating jobs, was industrialization. If you get the factories in Singapore, you create a lot of jobs in the process. And so you take the logic through. Once you decide that jobs was the major issue, industrialization was the way to meet the challenge. then you say what's required in industrialization. You know, you had to prepare the land, you had to prepare the factories, you had to prepare the housing for the people who are going to work in the factories. You're going to have to give recreation to the people who live in the housing in that area, because at that time, Jurong was quite isolated from the rest of Singapore. It is not like today where you can take the MRT to get there. And so you're creating a whole township which has to be in many ways self-sufficient. But you can build all the factories, and you now have to decide who's going to invest your money, their money in Singapore to build the factories and to work things through. And the decision there was that we need to get foreign investors to Singapore. And foreign investors, they don't only bring the capital and a managerial capability, but fundamentally they bring markets. The Singapore government would have enough money to set up a TV factory, but we wouldn't know where to sell the TV sets to after we produce the TV sets. When Sony sets up a factory to produce TV sets, they know where to sell to. So it's very important to recognize that the people who are going to invest in Singapore are going to produce stuff much, much more than for the Singapore market. They are here for the region, they are here for Asia, and you have to create the conditions for them to be willing to risk their money in investing in Singapore. So for Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, he had to say, so how does he create a nation brand of trustworthiness so people don't feel they're taking such a big risk to set up the factory in Singapore? How would they know that if Singapore promises tax incentives, it will be carried through? How do they know that peace and security is going to be maintained, and that there'll be not the racial riots in Singapore despite your multi-ethnic and multi-religious society? How do they know that they're not going to come to Singapore and face strike after strike, just like for many of them they were facing in their home countries? And Singapore introduced the idea of tripartism, where the government and the employers and the trade unions can sit at the table and discuss the issues on hand. So I wanted to say that just looking at jobs, it's a whole lot of different actions that have been brought together and functioning together as in an integrated kind of way. And that's an example of you can say, design thinking, not formally written in a paper, but certainly the way that you have to bring these various elements together to get a functioning whole.
And you spoke about Lee Kuan Yew's sort of long-term approach to thinking, right? You'd think in sort of 5, 10, 15-year chunks, right? This is, of course, something that Singapore continues to do today, as Aaron was discussing. To what extent has this long-term approach to planning helped the government, manage uncertainty and respond to shocks? A few examples would be great.
I would say from Lee Kuan Yew's mind, I'm sure he was thinking of the People's Action Party being forming the government for an indefinite period. So when you think that way, every policy you bring in, you think in terms of the sustainability of the policy. You think in terms of making a promise to the people or to the investors, and you're going to stick with it. And you're going to stick with it not just for 5 years for the next general election. You're going to stick with it for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, maybe 50 years, which actually happened for the PAP. So what I want to say is that once your mind is set on the basis of the People's Action Party, for example, forming the government for an indefinite period into the future, you begin to be very careful, very specific about the practices and the policies you introduce, because sustainability is all the time at the back of the mind. Because if you want to maintain trust in the government and trust in the people of Singapore, you're making a promise to people who invest here, you're making a promise to the people who come here to work in Singapore. You need to have policies which show that continuity. And obviously the policy is based on a thinking right from the start, that you're thinking 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, and you feel that any promise that you make is a promise that you can carry through for the next 30 years or even 50 years.
You can afford to think long term when you keep on winning election after election.
No, but it's made that way, right? I mean, the reason you can win election after election is because you had been thinking long term,
Right.
and you had made policies which is sustainable in the first place, rather than you make a policy which can win you the next election, and maybe that you can't carry through the next round, and you're not too you're neither surprised nor too unhappy for the opposition to come in, so that people can forget about your past promises, and then you try again after the opposition has run the government.
Let's talk about experimentation and prototyping. Can you talk about how important that has been to policymaking and implementation? And then just to pick up on a point that Aaron made in the earlier presentation, he was saying we should have more experimentation in policymaking. Do we have enough of it today?
Well, no, I must submit to what Aaron says. He's in the service. I'm no longer in. He says it's necessary, so I agree with him. But just as an example, I will give the example of education. Education obviously was put in as something very important for Singapore. You have to. It's not just academic. It's about skills training. It's about expanding the polytechnics and universities and so forth. When Singapore became independent, I would term that as survival-driven education. You are very clear. You open school places in order to give young people schooling which helps them to get a job, which gives them the basic skills upon which to build their future careers. But it's very survival-driven. That the subjects you teach, the emphasis you make, is all about whatever is necessary for Singapore to survive and whatever is necessary to give just a start or at least a job to the people who are coming to school and getting educated. I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew once made a point to sort of say that it's one thing for people to be rioting or going on strike in the streets. It's quite terrible when educated people are the ones in the streets. That's a big challenge. But an interesting happened because Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who was Minister of Finance, and he became Minister of Defense before he became Minister of Education. When he was Minister of Defense, he was struck by the fact that there were people who came out from the schools who were doing national service in Singapore who were literate neither in English nor in Chinese. And so in the Singapore Armed Forces, we had to set up what they call Hokkien speaking platoons. As you know, Hokkien is the most prevalent Chinese dialect in Singapore. And because these people were literate neither in English nor in Chinese, Dr. Goh decided he better set up these Hokkien speaking platoons, because if you are going to train your soldiers to handle weapons, you better at least teach them in a language they understand.
Seems sensible.
Yeah, seems sensible. But after that experience, when he went back to the Ministry of when he was made Minister of Education, he was determined that he has to stop this problem of Hokkien-speaking platoons. He has to get people through the system so that they get proper instruction in English or in Chinese or Malay or Tamil, whatever the ethnic background is. And then you are faced with this issue of resources, whether it is in terms of school places or more particularly in terms of teachers. And so I would say that Singapore education system moved to the next phase, which I would call efficiency-driven. Efficiency-driven in the sense of saying you take into account the resource constraints that you have, but do the best possible job to produce the students who are at least literate in English, literate in Chinese. And so in that sense, it was efficiency. Dr. Goh even introduced something he called teacher-proof materials, So because you expanded your school places so much, quite obviously, if you expand the school places and you want to have be able to accommodate so many more students, the quality of the teachers that you recruit must go down. That's just a natural outcome. So if the quality of teachers go down, what do you do to maintain the quality of their instruction? And to maintain that, we created this Curriculum Development Institute of Singapore to produce teacher-proof material. In other words, there are handbooks you produce for teachers such that it is not dependent on the quality of the teacher. The teacher's job is to make sure she reads the handbook very carefully and deliver the lessons according to what a handbook says she's supposed to deliver. And that way you maintain the quality of education with less dependence on the quality of the teachers. That's the phase of what I call efficiency driven. But obviously, when you run that, and of course Dr. Goh introduced the massive streaming system in Singapore in order to have that efficiency when you are short of resources in terms of school places and teachers. At the same time, let's admit it, what you do there is you don't do well enough in terms of catering to differences in talents and differences in abilities, and therefore you are not doing as good a job as you can to help each child be the best he or she can be. And so the education system gets adjusted to what I call ability-driven. A lot more attention now being focused on the child, what the child is capable of being. And obviously to run such a system, the schools, the teachers need to be given a lot more flexibility to adjust according to what the quality of the students are that they have and what the quality of the teachers are that they have. And that's a phase in Singapore's education system where you began to have independent schools, autonomous schools, where you have schools, you have the sports school separate from the school of the arts because they begin to cater for different abilities of students, and that's where we are today. So in terms of experimentation, I wouldn't say that education went through an experimentation phase. It was not an experiment. It was just, that was the system that was used. However, it's about the openness of the mind. It's about doing this and looking to see what's working and what's not, and therefore being willing to make the adjustment.
Process of trial and error.
Right, it is. It is trial and error. Right.
Looking ahead to the future, what do you think are the greatest threats facing Singapore?
Well, I would say I think it's a threat to Singapore in the sense of nations face the same problem as companies, corporations face this problem, which is the threat that comes from success itself. That when you are successful, sometimes you begin to believe that you are successful because you have discovered the secrets of success. And the problem that you face there is once you think you've discovered the secrets of success, you become very defensive on what you have today because you think that to take in any other idea is a compromise on your capacity to keep succeeding because you've already found all the secrets of success. That, I think, is a big threat, an unawareness that you enter into this space where you become pessimistic on any new idea that comes because you think it make us worse than the past, since again, we have discovered the secrets of success. So I think there's a big danger. Companies face this problem. They think they already know how to make good money and they reject the new idea that's floating up. Nations face the same idea. So I think in the case of Singapore, we need to have the openness of mind. Maybe, like Aaron was talking, to be more experimental, to be more willing to take in ideas and see whether they work or not, rather than simply say, that's a different idea from what our experience has been, so we reject it. Instead to say, well, let's try it out and see how it works out. You need to be aware that everything that you do is the best that you are able to do at the point you introduce them. But the environment changes. The public you are serving changes. The quality of the people that you have to deliver on the services changes. The technology available to you changes. So the worst thing you can do is carry on with the practice without fully realizing that practice was like that because that was the state of knowledge, and most particularly, that was the stage at which you have the resources and the culture to support that practice. But the environment changes, and the big danger is not to be aware that the environment is changing, and therefore you need to keep not only adapting, but really innovating for the future. I think in the case of Singapore, we need to be a lot more willing to create new possibilities and new practices as opposed to react to it. There's a great tendency to react, if I knew what the future is like, if I knew what would happen in 10 years from now, or I can imagine what will happen 10 years from now, then I know how to build a plan to meet that requirement. So it's reactive mode. Whereas what Aaron was describing about complexity is you need to go more into a creative mode, where you're saying it's not there, nobody has seen it before, and let's try.
The courage to adapt and to advance an idea about how to meet the future, very important.
Because adaptation tends to be, let's improve on what we now have. I think we need to become a lot better in terms of creating something which we've never had before, and which maybe nobody else has ever done it before, but that courage and that willingness of mind to try and see where we can go with the idea.
Let's hear a little bit from the audience. We have a few questions that have come in. Do you recall any policy, product, or service division implemented by the government that you were unsure of at the time, but which yielded unexpected positive results?
You know, there's one thing, you know, a lot of people talk about traffic congestion, right? You know, in the really early days, before we have the MRT system, there was this idea about how do you control congestion in the city. And those were the days before we have this electronic road pricing system, because the technology was not available. So at that time we had, it was very manual system, you know, you have to display a coupon unless you have at least 4 persons in each car going through, and then these people who are checking to make sure that every car that goes through the gantry has at least 4 persons in order to be entering the city free, okay? Now the government therefore had this idea to say, well, you know, but we have to cater for the people who don't want to pay the fee to get into the central business district. So why don't we build these huge car parks so that the people will drive their cars, because they really, you know, they will die if they don't drive, okay. They drive into these huge car parks. You know, as you can see, even at Dempsey, there's this huge bus park. That was a huge car park. Just like with these huge car parks outside the National Stadium. All these were built just outside the central business district. And the theory there is people will drive their car, they park there at a much cheaper rate than the coupon they have to pay to get into a central business district. And there were these shuttle buses which will carry them into a central business district. The assumption there being that people can't stand it if they have the car, they just have to drive it in. However, they don't want to pay for the coupon to go into a central business district. They'll park in this huge car park, they get into the shuttle buses to go to there. Then we discover it's not like that. The people are saying, if I'm going to jump into a bus anyway, I might as well take the bus from my home. So the car parks were not used. Actually, you know, those of you who may know, next to Chancery Lane, they got this housing development there. That was actually a huge car park. It just ended up with much of this car park not being used. But of course, the government didn't tell you it was a big experiment, failed. You know, we built all these car parks and it was all empty. No. We cleared the land. It was used temporarily as car parks, but now they're used for housing and they're used for bus parks. It's okay, you know. So what you want is a government that says, you know, let's see what happens and learn from it and do a better thing with what we have.
The courage to adapt and the courage to admit when you're wrong.
Right, sure.
2 important principles.
Yeah, but you don't need to have a government go out and say, I made a big mistake, Singaporeans, you heard that. I made a big mistake, therefore next time please vote me again because I made this mistake and I told you about it. Yeah. Okay.
Very unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I think we'll do just one more question.
Right, please.
And possibly the hardest. Looking back from 2022, are you still content with the initial design of Singapore? What would you design differently?
I think, as I said, you know, everything that we do, bear in mind that it was the best that we could do with the resources that we had and with what we were capable of imagining at the time. So that very often people ask, you know, if you were there, what would you have changed? I would say that I would not have changed anything because we were trying the best that we could at that point in time. Okay, what do we need change going in the future? My view is this. when you look at when Singapore became independent, what did Mr. Lee Kuan Yew have to do? He had a big political challenge, right? He had to deal with the communists. He had to deal with how do you maintain the morale and motivation of Singaporeans despite the fact that we suddenly have independence. But in terms of the specific things he had to do, I would say that it's not too difficult to define it, right? Whether it's about jobs, it is housing for people, it is education for their children, it is healthcare, but that was not an overriding problem because the Singapore population at that time was relatively young. Transportation was not a big thing yet. Later on, it became a big thing. What I'm trying to say is that when you look at what the government specifically has to produce to the public, I have no doubt that just by dealing with the jobs issue and the housing issue, I have no problem imagining that 80% of Singaporeans will vote for the PAP. And the reason is simple, because we are all relatively equally poor, and we all appreciated the jobs, and we all appreciate their educational opportunities and so forth. But today is different. Today income levels have gone up, education levels have gone up. Each person feels that he's got a better idea on what to do. So I think we have to think a lot more in terms, like already starting, like you have this forum today, a lot more in terms of how do we create what Aaron had talked about, convening meetings, convening meeting places or people coming together. By convening itself is not good enough. Again, a word from Aaron. You need to aggregate the ideas because the point you want to make is that individual ideas on their own is very difficult to support. But if you can bring the ideas together and put them under a strategic umbrella, you are able to put budgets behind it, you are able to put people behind. But I would say, as a government now, you can't so easily say there are 3, 4, or 5 priorities that we have to deal with. Now you have to talk about multiplicity of wishes, multiplicity of ideas, and you have to create space for that. But where I think Singaporeans have to get used to is, it's not just about, well, you give your view, everybody has a view, and then you say, who's going to act on it? I say, I give a view for the government to do the things. I think the multiplicity of hopes and wishes are so great that we all need to be, you talk of agency, we all need to be a lot more active, a lot more willing to be involved in doing stuff, rather than simply saying, I voice my idea is for the government to deliver. I think that has to change. But I think in the process of changing, we are going to be a lot stronger than in the past, because you're going to have this diversity of views. We're going to learn a lot more of how to integrate this diversity so we get a lot more of the totality of the talents and abilities in Singapore than we've ever been able to get in the past. That's my view.
Thank you, Siong Guan. Perfect note to end on.